I sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee and looked at my bank statement. $750,000. The numbers looked almost unreal on the white paper, but I remembered where every significant amount came from. 24 years in the Human Resources Department at Pacific Industries, which manufactures parts for air conditioners. Not the most exciting job, but it was stable. And I knew how to not only save money, but also invest it. After my divorce from Richard, I had to quickly learn how to manage my finances. Elodie was only 12 at the time, and he paid child support sporadically until he disappeared from our lives altogether. I remember sitting at this same kitchen table, researching investments and planning a budget. I bought clothes at outlet stores, cooked at home instead of going to restaurants, and gave up expensive vacations. Elodie didn't understand why we couldn't afford what her classmates had. But I was persistent. I started with $500 a month, saving everything I had left after my necessary expenses. I bought shares in companies I understood and invested in index funds. When tech stocks skyrocketed in the 1990s, I made more than I had in several years of salary. Then there was a downturn, but I didn't panic. I reinvested the dividends and bought more when prices fell. In 2002, I sold the apartment in San Diego that Richard and I had bought and moved to a more modest home in Chula Vista. The difference in price, almost $300,000, also went into investments. Elodia was angry at the time that she had to change schools and leave her friends, but I knew I was making the right choice for our future. I was lucky with my job. Pacific Industries had a good employee profit-sharing program, and I took full advantage of it. When the company grew and went public, the stock price rose several times over. Plus, I got promoted. I started as a simple HR specialist, and now I was in charge of the entire department. In recent years, I was earning about $120,000 a year. Not bad for an HR manager at a manufacturing company. I spent no more than $60,000 on living expenses and invested the rest. The California real estate market also played into my hands. The small house I bought in Chula Vista 15 years ago for $200,000 is now worth more than $500,000. $750,000 was the result of 24 years of planning, discipline, and good decisions. But most importantly, I always remembered why I was doing it. I wanted to give Elodie what I didn't have when I was young: stability and the ability to not worry about money. A house seemed like the perfect gift. Elodie married Niels 3 years ago, and they rented a small apartment in a not-so-great neighborhood. Niels worked as a sales manager at an auto parts company, earning about $70,000 a year. Not poor, but not enough for a down payment on a mortgage. And real estate prices in California were such that young couples had to save for years or hope for help from their parents. I was planning to surprise her for her birthday next month. I imagined handing her the check, how happy she would be, how she would finally feel grateful for all those years when I made plans for the future instead of spending money on momentary pleasures. Maybe then she would stop talking to me as if I owed her something. Elodie changed after she got married. She used to at least ask me how work was going and take an interest in my plans for the weekend. Now, our conversations were limited to what she needed. She needed to borrow my car, babysit the neighbor's kid because their regular babysitter was sick, or cook dinner for her friends because their kitchen was too small for a party. Niels didn't come home at all that day, saying he was meeting friends. When he returned in the evening and saw the sparkling apartment, he didn't even greet me properly. He muttered something like "hi" and immediately started complaining to Elodie that there was no beer in the fridge. In the past, I would have told myself that he was just tired, that young people tend to be a little selfish, that they would grow up and learn to appreciate what people do for them. But now, looking at that statement, I realized that I was just making excuses for their behavior. $750,000 wasn't just a number on a piece of paper. It was the result of me thinking about the future my entire adult life, not just about today. Every financial decision was made with the intention of giving my daughter more opportunities than I had. I was turning 65 soon and starting to think about retirement. I had some savings in a retirement fund, but it would have been enough to live very comfortably. I had always dreamed of traveling to Europe to see the places I had only seen in magazines, or buying a small house by the ocean where I could watch the sunsets and not think about work. But my maternal instinct was stronger than my personal desires. I wanted Elodie to have the stability that I didn't have at her age. I wanted her to be able to plan for the future without worrying about rent and not being at the mercy of landlords. Having your own home is a foundation on which you can build your life. Yesterday, she mentioned that she and Niels had found a nice house in Eastlake. 3 bedrooms, a small garden, and a 2-car garage. The price was $850,000. The bank was willing to give them a mortgage, but they needed a down payment of 20%, which was $170,000. I planned to give them the rest of the money for moving expenses, furniture, repairs, and just as a safety net for the first few years. $750,000 would not only allow them to buy a house, but also feel secure for the first few years without having to count every dollar. I imagined how happy she would be when she found out. Maybe for the first time in a long time, she would look at me with gratitude and give me a real hug, not a formal one like she does now. Maybe we would become close again, like we used to be when she was little and told me all her secrets. The phone rang, and I saw Elodie's name on the screen. I wondered what she wanted this time. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was businesslike, without much warmth. "Listen, Niels and I want to come over for dinner on Saturday. Will you make something nice? I don't have any time and I don't feel like cooking." Even the invitation to come over for dinner sounded like an order. Not "we'd like to spend some time with you," but "make us dinner." I closed my eyes and counted to 10, as I had been taught in my stress management class at work. "Of course, sweetie. What time should we be there?" "We'll be there around 7. And don't make anything complicated. Niels doesn't like experiments. Something simple and filling would be better." She didn't even ask if the time was convenient for me or if I had plans for Saturday. She just told me when they would be there and gave me instructions about the menu. After she hung up, I sat there with the phone in my hands for a long time. $750,000. Maybe this was my last chance to fix our relationship, to show her that I was willing to make big sacrifices for her happiness. Or, on the contrary, it would only reinforce her belief that I would always do what she wanted, no matter how she treated me. I folded the bank statement and put it in my desk drawer. When Elodie was little, she always greeted me at the door after work. She would run up to me, hug my legs, and babble about her day. What she had for breakfast, who she played with in the yard, what books she read with the nanny. I remembered those hugs, so sincere, so full of love. She smelled like children's shampoo and the cookies Mrs. Robertson from next door bought for her. As a teenager, she became more withdrawn, but that was normal. All children go through a phase when their parents seem awkward and old-fashioned. Elodie would lock herself in her room, listen to music I didn't understand, and paint her nails black. But even then, she would sometimes come into the kitchen, sit down next to me, and tell me about her problems at school or the boy she liked. After graduating from high school, she enrolled at San Diego College to study business administration. I was so proud of her. She was the first in our family to get a college degree. She paid for her tuition with the savings she had accumulated over the years. $30,000 a year is a lot of money, but I considered it the best investment in the world. In her 3rd year, she met Niels at a party thrown by mutual friends. He was 2 years older, already working at an auto parts company, had his own apartment and a new car. When Elodie brought him home for the first time, I immediately sensed that he was judging our house critically. He greeted us politely, but his eyes scanned the old furniture, noticing the worn spots on the sofa and the crack in the wall that I had been meaning to fix. "It's cozy here," he said, but his tone was condescending. It was as if he was doing us a favor by finding something good in our modest home. Elodie began to feel embarrassed about our home. When she came over with Niels, they rarely stayed long. They would come in to say hello, have a cup of coffee, and leave to run errands. And when I offered to make dinner, Elodie said they had already planned to eat at a restaurant with friends. After the wedding, the changes became even more noticeable. Elodie and Niels rented an apartment in a new complex with a fitness center and a swimming pool. I was happy that they had their own place, but I was upset when I realized that they now expected me to visit them instead of inviting me over as an equal. I went to see them for the first time a week after they moved in. I wanted to see how they were settling in and help them unpack. But Elodie greeted me with the words, Mom, please take your shoes off. We have light-colored carpets, and we try to keep them clean. She had never asked me to take my shoes off at her house. I grew up in a family where guests were welcome and never made to feel uncomfortable over such small things. But I took off my shoes and spent the entire evening in my socks, feeling rather uncomfortable. That day, Neil showed me their new appliances: a huge TV, a coffee machine that cost more than my monthly salary, and a state-of-the-art dishwasher. He talked about each purchase with pride, explaining why that particular model was better than the others. I listened and nodded, but I felt that he wanted to impress me, to show that they lived better than I did. "You don't have a dishwasher at home, do you?" he asked, as if he didn't know the answer. "It's so convenient. You put the dirty dishes in, press a button, and an hour later everything is clean. You should think about buying one." Elodie smiled and added, "Yes, Mom, it's a really good investment. You'd save so much time." "Mom, you don't have anything to do on Saturday, do you?" she would say when she asked me to come over and clean before their guests arrived. It was as if my plans didn't matter, as if my life revolved around her needs. Neil supported this attitude. When I came over to help, he acted like the master of the house who had hired a maid. He would sit on the couch with a beer and watch TV while I cleaned their bathroom. Or he would give me instructions. "You need to wipe the inside of the refrigerator." Or, "Don't forget to vacuum under the bed." Elodie didn't stop him or say that it was wrong. On the contrary, she seemed to like the way he behaved, as if it proved that he was a real man who knew how to give orders. My daughter used to defend me if someone said something unpleasant to me. At school, if a teacher was unfair, or if the neighbors complained about noise we weren't making. Elodie had always been on my side, and now she was allowing her husband to treat me like a servant. A month ago, she asked me to babysit their 2-year-old son while they went to the movies. I agreed, thinking it was just a favor for a couple of hours. But when I arrived at their place, it turned out they had planned to be out all evening. First the movie, then dinner, then meeting other friends at a bar. "Mom, you love kids," Elodie said when I expressed my surprise. "And we need to relax. We haven't been out together in so long." I spent 6 hours with a stranger's child who cried, demanded his mother, and refused to go to bed. When they returned after midnight, Elodie was slightly drunk and cheerful. She thanked me in passing and immediately began telling Niels how much fun they had had. "We should do this more often," he said. "Your mom can always babysit." As if I were their permanent babysitter, not a person with my own plans and desires. At that moment, I noticed that Elodie had stopped taking an interest in my life. She used to ask me about work, how my weekend was, what I was reading or watching on TV. Now our conversations began with her talking about her own affairs and ended with requests for help. When I tried to tell her something about myself, she listened distractedly, glancing at her phone or thinking about something else. And if I mentioned how tired I was after a hard week at work, she would respond with something like, "Come on, Mom, everyone has a job. At least you have a steady salary and don't have to worry about a family." It was as if my problems were insignificant compared to her concerns as a young married woman. I began to notice that after talking to my daughter, I felt drained and sad. Before, seeing her energized me, and I enjoyed telling my colleagues about what Elodie was doing and how her life was going. Now I preferred not to mention our conversations because they left a bad taste in my mouth. It was especially painful to see how she interacted with her friends and colleagues. With them, Elodie was polite, attentive, interested in their opinions and plans. But she spoke to me casually, as if I were a piece of furniture that would always be there and didn't require any special attention. Niels made the situation worse. He often interrupted our conversations if he needed something from Elodie. He would walk into the room and start discussing his plans with his wife without apologizing for interrupting our conversation. Or he would turn on the TV at full volume when we were trying to talk in the kitchen. Eloise never said anything to him about his behavior. On the contrary, she immediately shifted her attention to her husband, as if our conversation was of no importance. I began to understand that a certain hierarchy had developed in their family, where my needs and desires came last. Niels was the head of the family, Elodie was his wife, and I was a free helper who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve them. And the saddest thing was that Elodie seemed genuinely unaware that I was being treated badly. For her, it had become the norm, the natural order of things. On Friday evening, I made a shopping list for Saturday dinner. Niels didn't like experiments, as Elodia reminded me, so I planned to make roast chicken with mashed potatoes and green beans. A simple, hearty meal that most people liked. For dessert, I decided to make apple pie. The recipe had been passed down in our family for generations. On Saturday morning, I got up early and went to the supermarket. I chose the chicken very carefully, looked for the freshest vegetables, and bought good butter and cream for the mashed potatoes. I spent almost $100 on food for dinner for 3 people, but I wanted everything to be perfect. I started cooking at home first thing in the morning. I kneaded the dough for the pie and put it in the refrigerator, cleaned and chopped the vegetables, and prepared the chicken for marinating. By noon, the kitchen was filled with the aromas of spices and fresh herbs. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the phone rang. Elodia was calling to confirm the details of dinner. "Mom, what wine did you buy?" she asked without preamble. "I didn't buy any wine," I replied, surprised by the question. "You didn't say we needed wine." "What do you mean you didn't buy any?" "Niels always drinks wine with dinner. He needs something red and dry, preferably not the cheapest." I looked at the clock. They would be home in 4 hours and the shops were still open. "Okay, sweetie, I'll run to the store and get some wine." "And one more thing, Mom," she continued. "Niels doesn't eat chicken skin. Take it off before you serve it. And make sure the mashed potatoes are smooth. He's very picky about texture." I had been cooking chicken for decades and knew how to make smooth mashed potatoes, but I kept quiet. Elodia spoke in a tone as if she were instructing an inexperienced cook. "And put cloth napkins on the table, not paper ones. Niels says paper napkins are a sign of bad taste." After the call, I went to the wine shop and picked out a bottle of red wine for $30. The salesperson assured me that it was a good Cabernet Sauvignon that would go well with the meat. I also bought some cloth napkins at a nearby store. My old ones now seemed insufficiently elegant. When I got home, I continued cooking. I removed the skin from the chicken, as Elodia had requested, even though I knew it would make the meat drier. I prepared the mashed potatoes with particular care, passing the potatoes through a sieve to ensure there were no lumps. By 6 o'clock, the table was set. I took out my best tableware, which was usually kept in the cupboard and only used on special occasions. The white plates with gold rims, which I had bought many years ago at a sale, but had saved for important occasions. I laid out new napkins and placed a small vase with flowers from the garden in the center of the table. I checked the living room one last time. I fluffed the pillows on the sofa, dusted the coffee table, and vacuumed the carpet. Everything had to be perfect. At 6:30, I changed into my best dress and put on some makeup. I looked at myself in the mirror and thought I looked quite presentable for a woman of my age. Maybe Elodie would finally appreciate my efforts. At exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, Neil's car pulled up outside the house. I looked out the window and saw them getting out. Elodie in a new dress I hadn't seen before. Niels in a shirt and trousers. They looked like they were going to a restaurant, not to a mother's house for dinner. I opened the door with a smile, ready to hug them, but Elodie immediately walked past me into the living room. "Oh, Mom, why is it so hot in here?" were her first words. "Can you turn on the air conditioner? Niels can't stand the stuffy air." "Of course, honey," I replied and went to adjust the temperature. Niels followed his wife, nodded to me in greeting, and sat down on the sofa without taking off his shoes. He took out his phone and started reading something, ignoring what was going on around him. "What's for dinner?" Elodie asked, glancing toward the kitchen. "It smells good, but isn't that too much spice? Niels has a sensitive stomach." I was cooking chicken with the same spices as always, a little rosemary, thyme, and black pepper. Nothing spicy or unusual, but I didn't argue. "If you want, I can serve rice instead of potatoes," I offered. "No, potatoes are fine," Elodie replied, continuing to look around the living room. "Why are there flowers? Niels is allergic. Better put them away." I took the vase of flowers to the bedroom, even though Niels was sitting at the other end of the room and hadn't even looked at them. But if Eloise said he was allergic, it was better to be safe than sorry. I looked at her plate. The mashed potatoes were perfectly smooth. I had spent over half an hour getting them to the right consistency. I think they're fine, I replied cautiously. No, there's definitely a lump here, insisted Elodie, pointing her fork at the perfectly smooth surface. Niels won't eat this. Niels hadn't even tried the mashed potatoes, but he nodded in agreement with his wife. Is there anything else? He asked. Pasta or rice? I went to the kitchen and quickly cooked some rice while they ate salad and complained that the vegetables weren't fresh enough. I had bought the tomatoes that morning at the same store as always, but Elodie insisted that they were kind of limp. When I served the rice, Niels tried it and said, well, that's better. Although you could have added some oil, it's too dry. I brought the oil, then the soy sauce, which he asked for 5 minutes later, then more bread because there's not enough. I ran back and forth between the kitchen and the dining room, fulfilling one request after another, while they sat and discussed their plans for the coming week. Where's the wine? Niels asked when I returned to the table for the umpteenth time. I brought the bottle and a corkscrew. He opened the wine, sniffed the cork with a serious expression like a real sommelier, and took a sip. Not bad, he remarked condescendingly, although I usually drink more expensive varieties, but it'll do for a home dinner. Elodie also tasted the wine and agreed with her husband. Yes, it's quite normal. Mom, your glasses are a bit small. Red wine needs large glasses so it can breathe. I only had the glasses that were on the table. I didn't collect wine glasses and didn't know all these subtleties. I'll buy some suitable ones next time, I promised. And also, added Elodie, red wine should be served at room temperature. This was too cold. I had stored the wine in a cool place, as the shop assistant had advised. But apparently, my knowledge of alcohol was insufficient for such connoisseurs. I spent the entire first half of dinner on my feet, bringing one thing after another. When I finally sat down to eat, my chicken had already cooled down. I felt less like a hostess welcoming dear guests and more like a waitress in a restaurant trying to please picky customers. Meanwhile, Elodie was telling Niels about her colleagues, completely ignoring my presence. They discussed people I didn't know, places I hadn't been to, plans that didn't include me. I sat there silently, nodding occasionally when one of them asked me to bring something from the kitchen. Niels finished his second glass of wine and leaned back in his chair, stroking his stomach. The alcohol had clearly loosened his tongue, because he began to speak louder and more confidently. Elodie looked at him admiringly, as if he were expressing particularly clever thoughts. You know, dear, he said to his wife, but loud enough for me to hear every word. Your mother is a good cook, but you can tell she's not used to serious cooking. I froze with my fork in my hand. Serious cooking? I had been cooking all my life, feeding my family, studying cookbooks, experimenting with recipes. What did he mean by serious cooking? Yes, I've noticed, Elodie agreed. Mom always cooked pretty simply, not like in the restaurants we go to. They were talking about me in the third person, as if I wasn't at the table. I was sitting 1.5 feet away from them, but they were discussing my cooking skills as if I couldn't hear them. Take this pie, Niels continued, pointing his fork at a half-eaten piece of apple dessert. The dough is heavy and the filling is sweet. It's nothing like the tarts we had at that French cafe last week. Oh, yes, Elodie chimed in. It was divine, and the presentation was so beautiful. Here. She glanced around the table. Everything looked so homemade, so plain. I spent the whole day preparing this dinner. I bought the best ingredients, cooked from morning till night, and tried to make everything perfect. And they sat there and compared my efforts to expensive restaurants where one dessert cost as much as I spent on the whole dinner. And anyway, Niels paused to take another sip of wine, you can tell she doesn't know anything about modern culinary trends. Everything is so old-fashioned. Mom always cooked the old-fashioned way. Elodia nodded. I tried to tell her about new techniques, but she's conservative. Conservative? I cooked what I knew how to cook and what people liked. Chicken, potatoes, homemade baked goods. It was normal, healthy food. But judging by their conversation, I was hopelessly out of touch and didn't understand what real cooking was. And her dishes are very simple, Niels remarked, picking up a plate and examining it in the light. You can tell they're inexpensive. My parents have a German dinner set, handmade. Now that's quality. My dishes had served me faithfully for over 15 years. White plates with gold rims, which I bought on sale but always thought were beautiful and elegant. It turned out that to her they were simple and inexpensive. And these napkins. Elodie picked up a cloth napkin I had bought especially that morning. What cheap fabric! Good restaurants have completely different quality tablecloths. I bought these napkins for $30 because Elodie said paper ones were tacky. And now it turned out that even cloth ones weren't good enough for their refined taste. Come on, dear. Niels put his hand on his wife's shoulder. Not everyone can afford quality things. Your mother has a modest budget. She saves on everything. A modest budget? I earned over $100,000 a year and could afford much more than they thought. I just didn't see the point in spending a lot of money on dishes or napkins that were only used once a month. Yes, Mom has always been thrifty, Eladia agreed. Sometimes even too much. Remember how she used to buy my clothes at thrift stores when I was little? I bought clothes at thrift stores because I was a divorced single mother and tried to give my daughter everything she needed within our budget. Elodie was always clean and well-dressed, even if she didn't have the most expensive clothes. But now she remembered it as if I had deprived her of something important. Do you remember our old car? She continued. I was so embarrassed when she drove me to school in that old banger. That car served us well for 8 years. It wasn't new, but it was reliable and economical. I could have bought a better car, but I preferred to spend my money on my daughter's education rather than on impressing her classmates. And her house is so small, added Niels. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. My parents' house is twice as big, with a pool and a garden. My house was big enough for one person. I bought it after my divorce, when the real estate market was more affordable. It was cozy, comfortable, and paid off. But in their eyes, it looked like a shack compared to the mansions they were used to. Mom could move into something nicer, Elodia remarked. But she's attached to her neighborhood. She doesn't want to change. I'm not attached to the neighborhood. I just didn't see the point in buying a house bigger than I needed just to impress other people. But explaining that was useless. They had already made up their minds about me. And what a boring job she has, Niels continued. HR in some factory. You can't compare that to a serious business. A serious business? He sold auto parts, and I managed the human resources department at a large manufacturing company with 300 employees. My job required knowledge of labor law, psychology, and personnel management. But in his mind, it was ubbering and not serious. Mom never had any ambitions, agreed Elodia. She's content with little. She never aspired to anything more. And she never complains, added Niels. She's so submissive. You tell her something and she just keeps quiet and does what she's asked. Submissive. That word cut me more than anything else. I wasn't submissive. I was a patient, loving mother who tried to maintain a good relationship with her daughter. But in their eyes, it looked like weakness, like a willingness to put up with anything. I even feel awkward sometimes, Elodie admitted. You ask her to do something, and she immediately runs to do it. She doesn't even try to say she has her own things to do. Embarrassed? Was she embarrassed that her mother loved her and was willing to help? But not so embarrassed that she stopped asking for favors. Come on, Niels reassured her. Let her feel needed. It's important at her age. And it's convenient for us to have such a helper. A helper. Not a mother, not a mother-in-law, but a helper. A woman who does housework and doesn't ask to be paid for it. By the way, Elodie turned to me. Mom, can you come over tomorrow and help us pack? We want to take our winter clothes to Niels's parents' cottage. They had spent half an hour discussing my shortcomings in the third person, and now they were calmly asking for another favor. As if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't said those things about me while sitting at my table and eating my food. Well, Mom, Elodie repeated. You're free tomorrow, right? I looked at both of them. At Niels, who was sprawled in his chair with a glass of wine, waiting for me to agree to spend my day off for free helping them move. At Elodie, who was looking at me with the same expression you give a servant waiting for them to agree to do something for you. At that moment, something clicked inside me. I realized I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't sit there and listen to them discuss my life, my home, my job in such a contemptuous tone. I couldn't pretend that it was normal to be a convenient helper who appeared at their beck and call and disappeared when they no longer needed me. $750,000. Money I had saved for years to help my daughter. Money that was supposed to be a symbol of my love and care. And she sat there with her husband, laughing at how pathetic I was. Mom? Elodie frowned when she didn't get an immediate response. Can you hear me? Can you come tomorrow? I slowly put my fork down on my plate and looked at her. A plan was already forming in my head. Not just refusing to help tomorrow, but something more. A decision that would change our relationship forever. I'll see, I replied quietly. They left around 10 o'clock in the evening, leaving me alone with a pile of dirty dishes and a heavy feeling in my heart. Elodie kissed me on the cheek goodbye, as always, and said, "Thanks for dinner." But her words sounded formal, without warmth. Niels muttered something like, "It was nice," and headed for the car first. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, closing my eyes. The house fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock in the living room and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The silence was deafening after an hour and a half of listening to them discuss my life, my home, and my job in a tone that made me feel like a failure who had achieved nothing. I walked into the kitchen and looked at the table. The remains of the dinner I had spent all day preparing were lying on the plates. Niels had eaten half the chicken and left all the side dishes, complaining about lumps in the perfectly smooth mashed potatoes. Elodie picked at her salad and ate only a piece of pie, talking about French desserts from expensive cafes. The wine glasses were empty. $30 a bottle, which Niels had called "not bad for a home dinner." As if it were a concession on his part to drink my cheap wine in my modest home. I began clearing the table mechanically, stacking the dirty plates in the sink. The cloth napkins I had bought especially for them were crumpled and splattered with sauce. "Cheap fabric," said Elodia. I had paid $30 for them, thinking I was doing something special for a family dinner. The gold-rimmed dishes I only took out on special occasions were plain and cheap in their eyes. Those plates had served me for over 15 years. I had bought them at a good store, chosen them carefully, thinking they were beautiful and elegant. But it turned out to be cheap compared to Nils's parents' German dinner service. I sat down at the kitchen table, not finishing the cleaning, and stared out the window. It was dark outside, with only a few streetlights illuminating the empty road. The neighbors were already asleep, their windows dark. Normal people were spending their Saturday evening peacefully, and I was wasting mine listening to my own daughter criticize my life. Mom has always been thrifty, sometimes even too much. Elodie's words kept spinning around in my head. Too thrifty? I had sacrificed myself to give her a good education. I bought her everything she needed, even if it meant denying myself something. And now she was talking about it as if I were a miser who had deprived her of a normal childhood. Second-hand clothes. Yes, I bought her things in thrift stores when she was little. But they were always clean, beautiful, and in good condition. I spent hours rummaging through racks to find something suitable. Elodie always looked neat and pretty, but she was ashamed of our old car, our small house, my modest job. Our old car. It had served us for 8 years without any serious breakdowns. It took Elodie to school, to her extracurricular activities, to the doctor, to her friends. I could have bought a newer, more expensive car with a loan, but I preferred not to go into debt. I saved money for more important things: my daughter's education, our future, and the house. Small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. When I bought it after my divorce, it seemed wonderful to me. My own house, where no one could tell us what we could or couldn't do. Where Elodie could bring her friends, where she had her own room that she could decorate to her liking. But in my son-in-law's eyes, it was a shack compared to his parents' house. My job was boring and unimportant. I had worked at the same company for 24 years, rising from a junior specialist to a department head. I earned over $100,000 a year, which was not bad for a woman of my education and age. But Niels, who sold auto parts, considered my job unworthy of respect. Mom never had any ambition. These words hurt me deeply. No ambition? I raised her on my own, working and studying at the same time to get promoted. I saved money, invested it, planned our future. What more ambition did my daughter need? I stood up and walked over to the window, looking at my reflection in the dark glass. A 64-year-old woman who had worked, saved, and planned her entire life, who had denied herself pleasures for the sake of her daughter. And my daughter was sitting at my table, laughing at my submissiveness. Now, after tonight, that idea seemed absurd to me. Why give such a huge amount of money to someone who considers me a failure, who laughs at my lifestyle, my values, my achievements, who sees me only as a free servant, ready to do anything she asks? Elodie didn't appreciate what she already had. She didn't appreciate my help, my love, my time. She took everything for granted and was ashamed of me in front of her husband. She told him about my shortcomings, about how embarrassed she was as a child because of our modest life. What would happen if I gave her this money? She would buy a house in a prestigious neighborhood and entertain guests in beautiful rooms with expensive furniture. She would tell her friends about her new home and forget to mention where the money came from. Or even worse, she would talk about it with the same dismissive tone. Mom finally decided to spend her savings on something worthwhile. I imagined how she and Niels would furnish their new home, how he would choose expensive appliances and she would choose furniture and decor, how they would invite friends over for a housewarming party and proudly show off every room. And maybe they would mention in passing that Mom helped with the down payment, as if it were a trifle and not the result of my entire life. And then what? Then they would get used to their new lifestyle and start looking for new flaws in my life. My house would seem even more modest compared to their spacious home. My car, my clothes, my lifestyle, all of it would become even more unsuitable for their company. I got up and started pacing around the kitchen, thinking about the situation. $750,000 could change my own life dramatically. I could buy the apartment by the ocean I had always dreamed of. I could travel, see the world I had only seen in magazines and on television. I could live comfortably and beautifully without having to justify my modest lifestyle to my daughter. Or I could have invested that money even more wisely and secured a luxurious retirement for myself. I wouldn't have had to depend on government benefits, scrimp and save, or think twice about every little expense. I could have lived the way I wanted to, not the way my budget allowed. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. Elodie had to understand that attitudes have consequences, that you can't endlessly exploit someone's love without giving anything in return. That respect has to be earned, not automatically granted because of family ties. I thought about what I would say to her when she called asking for money. And she would definitely call, because she was used to her mother always helping her. She was used to me never saying no, never setting conditions, never demanding gratitude or respect. But this time it would be different. This time I would say no and explain why. Not because I don't have money, but because I no longer want to be a submissive helper who exists only for the convenience of others. Elodia will be shocked. She's used to her mother always accommodating her, always sacrificing her own interests for her sake. The refusal will come as a surprise to her, perhaps even a blow. But maybe it will make her rethink her attitude toward me. Or maybe not. Maybe she'll just get angry and say that I've become selfish in my old age, that I don't want to help my only daughter because of some grudges, that I'm acting like a spoiled child who sulks over trifles. But even if that's the case, I couldn't go on living the way I had been. I couldn't pretend that tonight hadn't happened, that I hadn't heard them laughing at my life, my values, my efforts. I took my bank statement and stared at the numbers for a long time. $750,000. My freedom, my independence, my right to live the way I want, not the way others expect me to. My decision was final. I would not give this money to Elodie. I would not buy her love and respect, which should be given freely. I would not reward her for allowing her husband to humiliate me in my own home. The dirty dishes were still in the kitchen, but I decided to leave the cleaning for tomorrow. I had done enough for today. I had cooked, cleaned, and endured humiliation. Tomorrow, a new life would begin. I woke up on Sunday morning with an unusual feeling of lightness. The sun was shining through the curtains, and the house was quiet and peaceful. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have to rush anywhere, take care of anyone, or fulfill anyone's requests. Elodia had asked me yesterday to help her move, but I hadn't given her a definite answer, and I wasn't going to call her today. I got up, made some coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table with my bank statement. $750,000. Yesterday, that money was meant for my daughter, and today it belonged only to me. It was a strange feeling, both frightening and exhilarating. What could I do with all that money? I had never planned to spend it on myself, so I hadn't even thought about the possibilities. I'd always thought only about how to help Eloise, how to secure her future. And now a whole new world was opening up to me. The first thing that came to mind was real estate. I could sell my house in Chula Vista and buy something better. Not because my house was bad, but simply because I could now afford it. An apartment with an ocean view, which I had dreamed of for years. Or a small house in Santa Barbara, where the air was cleaner and life was quieter. I opened my laptop and started browsing real estate websites. Prices in coastal areas were high, but not astronomical for my budget. A 2-bedroom apartment with a view of the Pacific Ocean cost about $600,000. Adding the money from selling my house, I could afford something really nice. I imagined getting up in the morning and the first thing I saw was the blue sea stretching to the horizon. I imagined drinking coffee on the balcony, listening to the sound of the waves. I imagined walking on the beach at any time of the day, whenever I wanted. No one would call with requests. No one would criticize my choice of furniture or dishes. But real estate isn't the only option. I've always dreamed of traveling. Over the years, I've accumulated a lot of vacation days, but I rarely used them. Either I didn't want to spend money on trips, or Eloise needed help at the time. But now I could afford to see the world. Europe. I had always wanted to go to Europe, but I kept putting off this dream for someday. Italy with its art and architecture, France with its wine regions and ancient castles, Spain with its warm climate and rich history. I could spend several months slowly traveling from country to country, stopping wherever I liked. I opened a travel agency website and started looking at offers. A month-long Mediterranean cruise cost $25,000 for a deluxe cabin. That price had seemed astronomical to me before, but now it seemed quite reasonable. A private tour of Tuscany with accommodation in historic villas cost $15,000 for 2 weeks. A trip to Japan during cherry blossom season was $12,000. I could spend $50,000 or even $100,000 on travel and still have a decent amount left over. In my entire life, I hadn't spent as much on vacations as I could now spend in a year. And I could have invested the money even more aggressively. Not in conservative index funds, as I had done before, but in something riskier but potentially more profitable. Shares in technology companies, real estate in developing areas, maybe even startups. At my age, I could afford to take more risks, especially if I didn't plan to leave an inheritance to an ungrateful daughter. I took a notebook and started writing down ideas. A new home by the ocean would improve my quality of life and could be rented out if I got tired of it. Travel would fulfill long-held dreams, provide new experiences, and broaden my horizons. Investments would offer potential capital growth and financial independence. And I could do the things I had always put off. Learn the languages I wanted to learn, take painting or music lessons, sign up for photography classes and combine them with travel. The University of San Diego had programs for adult students. You could get a master's degree in art history or history. Education. It's strange that I only thought of that now. All my life I invested in my daughter's education, but somehow forgot about my own. After school, I went straight to work because I needed money. Then marriage, a child, divorce. There was no time for studying, but now I had time and money too. I imagined myself as a student at 64, sitting in a lecture hall among young people, studying art history or archaeology. Ridiculous, maybe, but why not? Who said that education is only for the young? The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The screen lit up with Elodie's name. I looked at the clock. It was 11 in the morning. She was probably calling about my request for help with the move yesterday. I didn't answer. Let her wait. Let her understand that Mom isn't always available at the drop of a hat. That I have my own things to do, my own plans, my own life. 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was Elodie again. And again, I didn't answer. On the third ring, a message came through. Mom, Why aren't you answering? We're waiting for you. We have to be there before lunch. They were waiting for me. They didn't even ask if I agreed to help. They just assumed that I would come as always, that their obedient mother would drop everything and go carry their boxes. I replied, "Sorry, I can't today. I have things to do." The response came almost instantly. "What things? It's your day off. We were counting on you." What things? Do I have to report to my daughter on how I spend my time? Can't I have personal plans that aren't related to her needs? I didn't reply to the message. I turned off the sound on my phone and went back to my plans. A car. My car wasn't as old as Elodia said, but I could buy something better. Not to impress anyone, just for my own pleasure. A comfortable car for traveling, with a good sound system and comfortable seats. Clothes. I'd always bought practical, inexpensive things. Now I could afford quality clothes that would last a long time and look good. Not necessarily designer brands, but something better than what I bought in regular stores. Health. At my age, this was becoming increasingly important. I could see the best doctors, get a full checkup, and take preventive measures. Maybe hire a personal trainer to keep in shape, or sign up for regular treatments at a spa. Home. Even if I don't sell it, I can renovate it. I can update the kitchen, which I haven't changed in 10 years. I can replace the old windows with energy-efficient ones. I can landscape the garden, maybe even install a small pool, which Elodie was so critical of. I got up and walked around the house, looking at it with new eyes. Not the eyes of a daughter who saw only flaws, but my own. The house was cozy, comfortable, and paid off. It held many good memories. Maybe I shouldn't sell it. Maybe I should just make it even better for myself. The kitchen needed updating, that was true. But not because it was simple, as Neil said, but because I wanted to change something myself. New cabinets, modern appliances, granite countertops, not to impress guests, but for my own comfort. The bathroom could also be made more comfortable. A large bathtub where I could relax after a hard day. Good lighting, high-quality fixtures. All the things I had been saving up for years, putting money aside for my daughter. The living room, the sofa, which Neil's criticized for its worn spots, really needed to be replaced. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because it had become uncomfortable. I could buy nice furniture that would last a long time and be pleasing to the eye. I went back to the table and continued making my list. I had so many ideas that I didn't know where to start. For the first time in my life, I had so many possibilities, and it was both exciting and a little scary. But most importantly, I felt free. The freedom to choose what to do with my own money. The freedom to spend it on myself, not on someone who didn't appreciate my sacrifices. The freedom to live the way I wanted, not the way others expected me to. My phone vibrated again, another message from Elodie. I didn't even bother to read it. Whatever she wrote wouldn't change my mind. My time as a submissive assistant was over. It was time to live for myself. On Tuesday evening, as I was cooking dinner for myself, the phone rang. Over the past 2 days, Elodie had called several times, but I had answered briefly, saying I was busy. She was clearly puzzled as to why her mother had suddenly become so unavailable, but she hadn't pressed for an explanation. This time, there was an unusual excitement in her voice. "Mom, I have amazing news," she began without preamble. "Niels and I went to see that house in Eastlake again today. Remember I told you about it?" I remembered. A 3-bedroom house for $850,000, requiring a down payment of $170,000. "Yes, I remember," I replied calmly, continuing to stir the soup on the stove. "So it turns out the owners are willing to lower the price a little. They're in a hurry to sell because they're moving to another state. We can get it for $820,000. That's great." Elodie's voice was full of excitement, as if she had won the lottery. $30,000 was a nice savings, but not enough to shout about to the whole house. "Congratulations," I said neutrally. "And Mom, we met our neighbors. They're so nice. They have 2 kids about our age. The husband works in IT, and the wife runs her own interior design business. Can you imagine what the neighborhood is like?" Elodie talked about our future neighbors with such enthusiasm, as if she were already part of their circle. I listened and thought about how quickly she had forgotten about Saturday dinner. about her comments about my submissiveness and modest budget. And the house is even better inside than it looked at first, she continued. The kitchen is huge with an island in the middle. You could cook for large groups, and the living room has a real wood-burning fireplace. Niels said it would be very cozy in the winter. I imagined them in that house. Elodie cooking dinner for new friends in the spacious kitchen. Niels lighting the fireplace and feeling like the lord of the manor. Their guests admiring the surroundings and the interior. And the bathroom in the master bedroom is just fabulous, Elodie enthused. A jacuzzi, a separate shower, double sinks, just like in an expensive hotel. Every detail she described should have made me happy for her future happiness. But instead, I felt detached, as if I were listening to a stranger talk about someone else's life. And there's also a small study, my daughter continued. Niels wants to set up a home office there. He says he'll work from home 2 days a week. It'll save on gas and give us more time together. Saving on gas. Funny to hear that from someone who had criticized my thriftiness. But when it came to their own spending, saving money suddenly became a sensible strategy. Mom, are you listening? Elodie asked, noticing that I had been silent for too long. Yes, I'm listening. The house sounds very nice. Sounds? It doesn't sound, it's perfect. We fell in love with it at first sight. True, the price is high, but with your help, we can manage. There it was. Finally, we got to the point. All that enthusiastic chatter was just a prelude to asking for money. Elodie wasn't talking about the house because she wanted to share her joy with her mother, but because she was laying the groundwork for a conversation about finances. I wanted to ask you about this in person, she continued, her tone becoming more serious. You remember that you promised to help us buy a house, right? Well, you didn't promise outright, but you said you'd think about it. I didn't remember promising anything. We had discussed their plans to buy a house several times, and I had indeed thought about helping, but I hadn't made any promises. Elodia, I never made any promises to you about money, I said calmly. Come on, Mom, don't split hairs. You know we're counting on your support. You have savings, and we need a down payment. They were counting on my support. They weren't asking or hoping. They were counting on it, as if it were something that went without saying, as if it were a service that a mother was obliged to provide to her adult daughter. How much exactly do you need? I asked, even though I knew the answer. Well, the down payment is now $164,000, plus the cost of registration, home inspection, insurance, another $10,000. And I'd like to have a safety net for the first few months, $50,000. That comes to about $225,000. $225,000. A third of my savings. But I was sure that Elodie was expecting a larger amount. She probably thought I would give her half or even more so that they could not only buy the house, but also furnish it to their liking. That's a lot of money, I remarked. Mom, what are you talking about? It's no problem for you. You have savings, you told me yourself. And a house isn't some trifle. It's an investment in our future. An investment in their future. Not in mine, not in our relationship, but specifically in their lives, from which I was effectively excluded. I was supposed to finance their happiness while remaining a generous but invisible sponsor. Besides, Elodie added, we're not asking for a gift for nothing. It's a house where you'll always be a welcome guest, where we'll get together for holidays and have you over on weekends. Can you imagine how great it will be to spend time in a beautiful, spacious house? A welcome guest. After Saturday dinner, those words sounded particularly cynical. I imagined myself in their new home, sitting on an expensive sofa in a beautiful living room while Elodie and Niels discussed my shortcomings, ignoring the fact that I could hear them. I have this money, I said slowly, but I'm not going to give it to you. There was silence. A long, heavy silence during which I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen and the soup bubbling on the stove. What? Elodie finally said. I didn't understand. What did you say? I said I'm not giving you money for the house. Mom, is this some kind of joke? You can't be serious. I'm absolutely serious. But why? Elodie's voice began to sound panicked. What's wrong? Are you having money problems? Do you need money for medical treatment? She tried to find a rational explanation for my refusal. Anything but that her mother simply didn't want to finance the life of her ungrateful daughter. I'm fine, I replied. And so is my money. I just decided to spend it on myself. What about your children? She continued. Aren't parents supposed to help their children? Isn't that your duty? Duty. Not a desire, not an expression of love, but a duty. Elodie believed that I owed her money simply because I was her mother. It was my duty to raise you, educate you, and set you up in life, I replied. I did all that. You're a grown woman with a job and a husband. Now you have to fend for yourself. I can't believe you're saying that, Elodie was almost shouting. We are your family, the only people you have, and you choose some silly whims over our happiness. Silly whims. She called my dreams and plans silly whims, and their desire to live in an expensive house at my expense was apparently a necessity of life. Elodie, on Saturday evening, you and Niels spent an hour and a half discussing my life, I said, trying to remain calm. You talked about what a failure I am, how bad and cheap everything I have is. You laughed at my submissiveness, and now you want this same failure to give you almost all of her savings? Mom, we didn't mean any harm. We were just discussing, we love you. That's a very strange way to express love, I remarked. Okay, maybe we got a little carried away, but that's no reason to deprive us of your help. We'll apologize if we hurt your feelings. If I was hurt, not we were wrong, but if you're hurt. Even now, she didn't admit that their behavior was unacceptable. Elodie, the decision has been made, I said firmly. There will be no money. Mom, she cried, you can't do this. We already made a deal with the sellers. We were counting on you. You shouldn't have counted on us. You should have asked first, then made plans. You're ruining our lives. Elodie's voice trembled with rage. You're willing to destroy our future because of some hurt feelings. I'm not ruining anything. I'm just not financing your plans. Find another way to buy a house. There are no other ways. The bank won't give us a loan for the entire amount. It will take us years to save up for the down payment. Then you'll have to save, like millions of other people do. Elodie fell silent. I could hear her heavy breathing and knew she was trying to find an argument that would make me change my mind. Mom, she finally said in a softer tone, let's meet and talk calmly. I'll come over and we'll discuss everything. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, I replied. Everything is very clear. Then I don't know what to say. Elodie's voice became very quiet. I never thought you were capable of such cruelty. Cruelty. I was cruel because I refused to give my daughter almost all my savings after she humiliated me in my own home. Goodbye, Elodie, I said and hung up. The phone rang again immediately, but I didn't answer. Then several messages came, which I also didn't read. I turned off the phone and went back to my dinner. The sun was setting outside, bathing the kitchen in a soft golden light. I sat alone at the table and ate the soup I had made for myself. No one criticized its taste, no one asked for salt or anything else. For the first time in many years, I felt that my life belonged only to me. 3 weeks had passed since that conversation with Elodie. She called several more times and sent messages, but I didn't answer. Once she even came to the house, stood at the door, and rang the bell for half an hour. I was home, but I didn't open the door. Through the window, I could see her walking around the porch, looking in the windows, trying to figure out if I was inside. Finally, she left a note in the mailbox. It was a long letter explaining how she and Niels had lost their dream house because of my selfishness, how they had to look for cheaper options in a less prestigious neighborhood, how she couldn't understand what had happened to me and why I had become so cold. I read the letter once and threw it away. The same old complaints, the same conviction that a mother must sacrifice herself for her adult children. No understanding that her behavior was unacceptable. I managed to accomplish a lot in those 3 weeks. I started small. I enrolled in Italian classes at a community college. Twice a week in the evenings, I sat in a classroom with students of all ages and studied the basics of grammar. The teacher, a young woman in her 30s who was born in Milan, talked not only about the language, but also about the culture, traditions, and peculiarities of life in Italy. At first, I felt awkward. There were people of different ages in the group, but most were younger than me. There were several college students, young married couples planning a vacation, and a middle-aged man who was going to open an Italian restaurant. I was one of the oldest students, but after a couple of classes, the awkwardness disappeared. It turned out that age doesn't matter when everyone is learning something new. The young people didn't look at me funny or wonder why I was there. To them, I was just another student, the same as them. In the third class, we studied the topic of family and relationships. The teacher asked everyone to talk about their families in Italian, using new words. When it was my turn, I said a few simple phrases. Mi chiamo Gloria. Ho una figlia. Lei abita a San Diego. My name is Gloria. I have a daughter. She lives in San Diego. The teacher nodded and moved on to the next student. No one asked why I didn't say more about my daughter or inquired about our relationship. For them, it was just language practice, not an opportunity to ask questions about my personal life. After class, I went to a travel agency near the college. I spent a long time looking at offers for Italy and asking the manager about different trip options. In the end, I chose a 3-week tour of the north of the country: Rome, Florence, Venice, Lake Como. It wasn't a group tour with a fixed itinerary, but an individual trip with pre-booked hotels and the opportunity to plan each day independently. The trip cost $12,000. Previously, such an amount seemed astronomical to me for a vacation. I was used to spending a maximum of a couple of thousand on vacation, and even that was rare. But now this money didn't seem excessive. It was an investment in my own impressions, in an experience that would stay with me forever. The travel agency manager, a woman my age named Carol, talked about the trip with enthusiasm. She had been to Italy several times herself and knew many practical details. "Your age is the perfect time to travel," she said, showing me photos of hotels. "The children are grown up, and work doesn't tie you to one place so much. You can afford a more comfortable vacation without skimping on every little thing." Carol didn't know the details of my situation, but her words reflected a common point of view. At 64, a woman has the right to think about herself and not just the needs of her family. It's normal and natural, not a sign of selfishness, as Elodia believed. I paid a deposit for the trip and received a detailed itinerary. The flight was in 2 months, at the beginning of May, when it was already warm in Italy but not too hot yet. That was enough time to prepare, brush up on my language skills, and study the routes and sites. At home, I took out an atlas and spread it out on the kitchen table. I spent a long time looking at the map of Italy, marking the cities I planned to visit. I read about the history of each place, what to see, and where to stay. It was like planning a big project, only much more enjoyable than work tasks. I found travel forums on the internet where people shared their experiences of traveling in Italy. I read tips on how to get around between cities, which museums to visit, and where to try the local cuisine. Some of the recommendations were from people my age who had also discovered the joy of independent travel. I was particularly interested in Florence, a city of art and architecture where you can spend days going from one museum to another. The Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. Names that I knew from books and TV programs would soon become real places that I would see with my own eyes. On the weekend, I went to San Diego, to a large bookstore, and bought several guidebooks on Italy. At home, I spread them out on the coffee table in the living room and read them in the evenings, planning each day of the trip. It became a new hobby, replacing my evening TV programs. My colleagues at work noticed the change in my mood. I became more lively, smiled more often, and talked enthusiastically about my vacation plans. Maria, my assistant, was surprised to hear about the upcoming trip. "Gloria, you never talked about wanting to travel before," she remarked during our lunch break. "What's changed?" I thought about her question. What had really changed? I hadn't come into any extra money, and I hadn't suddenly become a different person. I had simply stopped putting other people's needs above my own desires. "I guess I realized that life isn't endless," I replied. "And if I don't start living now, when will I?" Maria nodded understandingly. She was 45, with 2 teenage children and a husband with an unstable income. She spent most of her salary on her family and rarely allowed herself anything personal. But in her eyes, I saw not condemnation of my decision, but rather a slight envy. "And how did your daughter react to your plans?" she asked. "My daughter is busy with her own life, I replied evasively. I didn't tell my colleagues about the conflict with Elodie. I didn't want to hear advice about the importance of family relationships and the need to forgive loved ones. My decision was well thought out and final, and I didn't need anyone else's opinion on the matter. That evening, when I got home, I found another letter from my daughter in the mailbox. This time it was short, just a few lines. Elodie wrote that she missed me and wanted to restore our relationship. She said she was ready to apologize for everything she had done to hurt me and asked me to give her a chance to make things right. I reread the letter several times. There were no previous complaints or accusations, only a request for reconciliation. Perhaps Elodie really understood that she was wrong, or maybe she just decided to change tactics, hoping that a softer approach would be more effective. But even if she was sincere, it didn't change the essence of the problem. Our relationship was built on inequality, where I always sacrificed my interests for her needs. Even after reconciliation, we would most likely return to the same pattern of behavior. I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer next to my bank statement. Perhaps someday Elodie and I will be able to build a new relationship based on mutual respect. But until she is ready to accept me as an equal rather than a convenient assistant, communication between us is impossible. The next day, I went to the bank to get a card for my trip. The manager, a young man in his 30s, looked at my credit history and account statements. "You have excellent financial discipline," he remarked respectfully. "It's not often you see savings like this at your age." "I've been saving money my whole life," I replied. "And now you've decided to spend it on yourself? That's a good decision. Many people save their whole lives and then don't have time to enjoy the fruits of their labor." His words sounded like approval of my choice. The bank employee, who was used to working with people's finances, thought it was normal for a woman my age to spend her savings on her own needs. After getting a credit card, I went to the mall to shop for my trip. A new suitcase, comfortable shoes for long walks, light clothing for warm weather. At the clothing store, a sales assistant, a woman about my age, helped me choose items. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked, putting my purchases in a bag. "Yes, alone," I replied. "How wonderful. I dream of a trip like that too. My husband doesn't like Europe. He prefers beach vacations. But I want to see museums, architecture, and experience the atmosphere of old cities." She spoke with a hint of envy, but without judgment. For her, a woman traveling alone to Europe was a dream, not a strange whim. At home, I laid out my new things on the bed. A beautiful suitcase on wheels, comfortable shoes I could walk in all day, light blouses and pants. All of this was waiting for a trip that would be the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I went to the window and looked out at the street. Neighbors were watering their lawns. Children were playing in the yards. Life was going on as usual. In 2 months, I would be in another country, in another world, among people speaking an unfamiliar language. It was exciting and a little scary, but at the same time, I felt a sense of anticipation for adventures that I hadn't had in my life for many years. The anticipation of the freedom to choose where to go and what to do without looking back at other people's expectations and needs. $750,000 gave me that freedom. Not just financial freedom, but emotional freedom too. Freedom from feeling guilty about how I thought about myself. Freedom from having to justify every decision to people who didn't appreciate my sacrifices. Elodia thought I was selfish. Maybe she was right. But after 24 years of self-sacrifice, I was entitled to a little healthy selfishness.